Hey guys, it's me Rena from Crochet. In today's video, I will be sharing you some tips and tricks for flying with crochet. Now, for those of you who have been following around for a little bit, you know that I travel pretty frequently, very often for work actually. And so I decided to compile some travel tips for if you want to take your crochet on the go. Now, for reference, I primarily travel domestically within the United States. I have not traveled internationally with my crochet. I have traveled internationally, just not with crochet. So things might be a little bit different there. So most of these tips are focused on traveling within the continental US because that's what I primarily do. Now, first things first, determine how long your trip is because that is important for figuring out how much yarn to bring with you and what project you want to bring. Let me tell you something, business travel and fun travel are two types of traveling. So for fun travel, you can kind of do what you want, honestly. The trips are longer and you have a little bit more leeway of like your flight scheduling, ideally. Unless if you're one of those people who take weekend trips, that's also a factor too. But a lot of business travel, you go there and then you leave. You don't really, at least for me, I don't really stay and play around, mainly because the places I go to for work are really boring. There's not a lot of fun involved. Some of my coworkers are crazier. They like to fly in the morning of and then fly out that evening. So I don't do that, but situations like that do dictate, what I bring with me on the plane to crochet. If you have a longer trip, you will check a luggage. If you have a shorter trip, you'll probably just have a carry-on bag and like a backpack. That's something you want to take into consideration when you do travel. Now, tip number 2, pick an appropriate project. Depending on your travel plans, you either have unlimited time to crochet or the only times you're crocheting is at the airport and on the plane. I recently went to Houston to see my family, which was a vacation, and that vacation, I did a lot of crocheting. It was great. I did quite a bit of work on a blanket, but most of my trips, because I'm going to my destination for work, I tend to bring simpler projects because most of those projects I only crochet on that plane ride or at the airport. Sometimes during the layover, sometimes I don't have a layover. So it really just depends on your travel schedule. I would say for those types of situations, I personally cannot recommend specific projects, but things like hats, scarves, and wearables are projects I tend to recommend when you crochet on the go. This cardigan I'm wearing right now, I actually worked on part of this on a plane. So it kind of depends on what you prefer to do. I will say if you are going to crochet on the plane, I recommend projects that have like at most 2 skeins at the time, primarily because the yarn will get tangled up in that confined space. So try to keep it to 1 or 2 skein projects. Not necessarily like it takes like 1 or 2 skeins to make the thing, but more so you are like working with maybe at most 2 different skeins of yarn at one time if you're doing something colorful, for example. I will list out a couple of projects I don't recommend taking on a plane, and that includes blankets, amigurumi, and complex tapestry work. For blankets, it's because they're too big. Plain and simple, they're giant. Imagine working on like a queen size blanket in a really narrow plane seat. Maybe you can start a blanket on the plane, but depending on how far you are in that blanket, those blankets are huge and they probably are not fitting in your backpack. For amigurumi, yeah, you can crochet the shell of a amigurumi, but then you have to stuff it, which stuffing takes up room and is messy. And then the safety eyes, like you can do it, but it's not fun. Complex tapestry, I think as I said earlier, your yarn gets tangled on the plane because you're crocheting in a kind of confined space on that plane seat. So if you have multiple skeins of yarn going on at once, it's not fun for anybody. It's already a mess doing it at home. You don't want to do that on the plane. So those are my suggestions. So for gadgets, I personally do not have product recommendations because I don't really use products. My habit to bring crochet on the go is that I shove yarn and some crochet hooks in my backpack and go. But if you want to be a little bit more organized, I have seen some designated yarn travel bags, and I haven't looked into them, so don't ask me for recommendations. I don't know. These bags are designed to carry your yarn, keep your yarn organized, and keep your crochet hooks and notions organized too, so they can be really good, useful tools to have when you travel with your crochet. I will say this is really great if all of your personal items are in your carry-on bag, because then you can just have unlimited crafting potential with a designated yarn bag. Another thing I don't use, but I have considered using, are those hanging yarn holders. I personally like center pull, but when I travel, I've kind of learned to reconsider whether I like to center pull or not, because your center pull gets messed up on the plane, especially when you're like me and you shove everything in a backpack. For me at least, that problem could be solved by having a designated yarn bag, or you can pull from the outside and use those hanging yarn holders, depending on how you are. I have genuinely considered the hanging yarn holder for traveling and pulling from the outside, because every time I do a center pull, it gets everywhere. It was awful. It's bad. I also have seen someone use a yarn sleeve too. They're basically like those cup cozies, except for yarn. When I first saw it, I was like, what is this? But when, the creator explained that to me, it made sense. I have not used it, but I think it's something I should also look into. In the meantime, I currently just suffer. I will say the biggest travel gadget I recommend, and I also currently do not use, but I am considering buying, is one of those reading neck lamps. Airplanes like to turn the lights off if you have an early morning flight or a late night flight. And I have been in situations personally where I've had to ask the person next to me if they're cool if I turn on the overhead light in the plane. Most people are pretty cool about it, but if you want to avoid that awkward interaction, I highly recommend getting yourself one of those reading neck lights. Now let's talk packing your materials. I will say you can take most standard crochet hooks onto the plane. There is no problem. I've never had a problem, though keep in mind, I have not traveled internationally. As long as all of your stuff is contained in one space, you should be fine. There are hook holders. I do not have one because I keep my crochet hooks in an Ipsy bag that I got years ago. Ignore that. Inside, I have stitch markers. I have my little thingy of darning needles right here. And I have hooks. I like to use metal darning needles, and you can find most of these in a little tube like this at most craft stores, so there should be no problem. The general idea is as long as everything is contained, you're fine. Now for scissors, this is where you want to kind of listen up a little bit, because the TSA guidelines say that as long as the blade of the scissors are less than 4 inches, you should be allowed to take them on the plane. Now I have little scissors here that I bought at Hobby Lobby for under $1 like a year ago, and I use these and the blade's covered and it's fine, no problems. Most TSA agents are fairly cool about things like that. They've kind of relaxed over the years. But in the instance that your TSA agent is not cool, I highly recommend bringing dental floss, because dental floss, this little cutter right here, is also very good for cutting your yarn. I have this piece of worsted weight cotton right here, right? Get this out of the way. Like that, easy. So if you're very paranoid about bringing scissors onto a plane, or if TSA is not cool and they confiscate your scissors, your backup is dental floss. Now, the caveat I will have is that this does not work with anything over worsted weight. So if you happen to prefer crocheting with worsted weight or lighter, you're fine. If you prefer velvet yarn or chenille yarn or really bulky weight yarn, I don't have a solution for you, I'm sorry. Okay, now you've traveled, great, amazing, awesome. You know, you were enjoying your time out of home and stuff, and now you're coming back, but you happen to have bought way too much yarn while you were at your vacation spot. Here's another tip. I highly recommend vacuum seal bags. You can store all your whips and notions and yarn in a vacuum seal bag. This thing comes with a little pump to suck the air out, and then you can, you know, more easily fit stuff in your luggage. Or if you have more items than what can fit in your luggage, even with the vacuum seal, another option you can do, and it is something I have done too, is you can ship the item back to your home through the post office, depending on where you are. You can either go to the local post office, put all your notions into a pre-selected box at the post office of your choice, depending on how much yarn you have, or just use an old Amazon box from a friend, depending on who's around you and stuff. Pack it up and ship it to yourself. Considering most postage, it doesn't take too long to get there, and I think it'll take just enough time for you to ship it a couple days before you leave, get on a plane and get back, and it'll be there and you'll be safe. Well guys, those are all my tips and tricks for traveling with crochet. I hope some of this information is helpful for you. Again, most of this information primarily pertains to traveling within domestic United States. If you're in Europe or Asia or something, I can't help you, but maybe some parts of this can be useful. Also, most of this information is more focused on crocheting and flying. I have not brought knit onto a plane, so if you want like a flying with knitting video, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I hope this helped, and with that, I'll see you later. Bye guys!